Try not to look too pathetic when the guests arrive, Terrance. It's bad enough my ex-husband is the one managing the cleanup crew.
Terrance, good to see you. Keeping the place clean for us? Make sure my car is parked under the awning. I don't want it sitting in the back lot.
Keep it, Sherman. Valet is paid for as part of your package.
She has no idea that Wallace Heritage Hotels has never entered into any partnership with Mr. Douglas. No such agreement will ever be authorized.
Terrance, is this true?
Try not to look too pathetic when the guests arrive, Terrance. It's bad enough my ex-husband is the one managing the cleanup crew for my engagement party. Yvonne didn't even look up from her digital clipboard as she threw those words at me. She was standing in the center of the grand lobby of the Ashford Grand, the crown jewel of Peachtree Boulevard in Atlanta. She looked striking, I had to admit. She wore a fitted red dress that hugged every curve, her sharp, beautiful face tense with the stress of a perfectionist event planner. She was in her element, bossing around a dozen florists who were struggling to drape massive garlands of white orchids over the curving mahogany staircases. "I need the white orchids to cover every single inch of this banister," she barked at a young decorator who looked ready to cry. "This is supposed to be the most beautiful event this hotel has ever hosted. Don't make me regret choosing this place." I stood just 10 feet away, holding a thick operations folder. I was 39 years old, wearing my standard-issue navy blue operations manager suit. To her and to everyone else in this building, I was just Terrance, the quiet guy who made sure the toilets flushed, the lights stayed on, and the trash got hauled out of sight before the rich guests noticed. She finally turned her head and looked at me, her eyes sweeping over my simple uniform with a familiar mixture of pity and annoyance. "Are you even listening to me, Terrance? I need the service elevator cleared for the catering team by 4. If Sherman's family sees hotel staff dragging dirty linens through the main hall, I'll have your boss write you up." "The elevator is already cleared, Yvonne," I said, keeping my voice level, completely calm. "And the catering team has their own designated entrance at the back. They won't be using the lobby." She sighed, a dramatic, exhausting sound she used to make during our final years of marriage, whenever she felt I wasn't moving fast enough. "Fine. Just try to stay out of the main ballroom once the party starts. I don't want my friends asking why my ex-husband is carrying ice buckets." "I have a hotel to run," I replied quietly. "I'll be where I need to be." She scoffed, turning back to her florists. She had no idea. She really had absolutely no clue that the massive, historic hotel she was standing in, along with the other 11 properties under the Wallace Heritage Hotels banner, belonged to my family. She didn't know that the name on the corporate deeds, the name behind the $180 million empire, was mine. To Yvonne, I was the man she had outgrown. We had been married for 11 years. When we met, she was an ambitious, 24-year-old event planning assistant who was barely scraping by. I was a 28-year-old guy working the night shift at a midtown boutique hotel. We fell in love fast, or at least, we fell into a rhythm that felt like love. She was always the one with the big dreams, the loud voice, and the drive to conquer Atlanta's social scene. She loved the glamour of weddings and high-end galas. I, on the other hand, loved the quiet mechanics of hospitality. I believed that a great hotel didn't need its owner standing in the lobby collecting compliments. It just needed to run so perfectly that the guests never had to think about how it happened. I brought that same philosophy into our marriage. I did the cooking, handled the bills, kept our modest midtown apartment clean, and supported her as she built her business. But to Yvonne, my quietness looked like a lack of ambition. "You're 39, Terrance," she had told me on the night she packed her bags 6 months ago. "You've been an operations manager for a decade. You don't want to build anything. You don't want to be anyone. I can't keep waiting for you to want more out of life. I need a partner who matches my drive." She found that partner in Sherman Douglas. Right on cue, the heavy glass doors of the lobby slid open, and Sherman walked in. He was 33, 6 years younger than me, and dressed in a flashy, patterned suit that screamed for attention. He walked with the swagger of a man who had never had to work a day of manual labor in his life, He was a boutique hotel investor, or at least that was the title he liked to throw around at cocktail parties. "Yvonne, darling," Sherman called out, his voice echoing off the high marble ceilings. "The valet out front is a mess. I had to wait nearly 3 minutes." Yvonne's face instantly softened into a bright, adoring smile. She hurried over to him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I'm sorry, sweetie. I'll have the staff handle it. How did your meeting go?" "Excellent," Sherman said, loudly enough for the front desk staff to hear. "The investors are thrilled. I told them we're holding our celebration here at the Ashford Grand to show them the kind of standard we'll be setting for our new project. They're coming to the party tonight." Sherman's eyes shifted over Yvonne's shoulder and landed on me. A smirk played on his lips. He walked over, extending a hand that was entirely too soft. "Terrance, good to see you. Keeping the place clean for us?" I shook his hand, keeping my grip firm but polite. "Mr. Douglas, the ballroom is fully prepared for your guests." "Good, good," Sherman patted my shoulder patronizingly. "Make sure the bar is stocked with the good stuff. I can't have my business partners drinking house liquor. Oh, and here." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a $20 bill, and tapped it against my chest. "Make sure my car is parked under the awning. I don't want it sitting in the back lot." I looked at the $20 bill, then up at his smug face. "Keep it, Sherman," I said softly, slipping my hands into my pockets. "The valet is fully paid for as part of your event. Package." Yvonne stepped in, frowning at me. "Just take the tip, Terrance. Don't be difficult. Sherman is only trying to be generous." "It's fine, babe," Sherman laughed, pocketing the bill. "Some people are just comfortable where they are. You can't force them to take a step up." He turned back to Yvonne, pulling her away toward the elevators. "Come on, let's go check the penthouse suite. I want to make sure the view is perfect." I watched them walk away, their voices fading as the elevator doors closed. From the shadow of the grand staircase, Bernard Lowe stepped out. Bernard was 61, the general manager of the Ashford Grand, and a man who had worked for my family for 22 years. He was the only person in this entire building who knew exactly who I was. He walked over to me, his face tight with controlled anger. "I don't know how you stand it, Terrance. I really don't. I was ready to throw that man out of my lobby myself." I smiled faintly, looking down at my operations folder. "It's fine, Bernard. Just a few more months. I made a promise, and I'm going to keep it." "Your grandmother would be proud of you," Bernard said softly, his eyes softening. "But she never intended for you to take this kind of abuse." "She wanted me to learn what it actually takes to run this place," I said. And she was right. You don't learn how to manage $100 million company from a penthouse suite. You learn it down here, in the dirt. Tonight is going to be a very long night. The quiet hum of the service elevators was the only sound in the back corridor as I walked toward my small basement office. I needed a moment away from the lobby, away from the suffocating scent of the white orchids, and definitely away from the sight of my ex-wife leaning into another man's shoulder. Sitting down at my metal desk, I stared at a framed photograph tucked behind a stack of maintenance schedules. It was a picture of Yvonne and me from 10 years ago, taken at a tiny, poorly lit diner in Savannah. She had just landed her first solo gig as an assistant wedding planner, and we were celebrating with a $20 bottle of cheap champagne. Her eyes were bright, her smile wide and genuine, completely free of the hard, calculating edge that defined her now. We had spent 11 years together, 11 years of shared dreams, late-night takeouts, and the slow, agonizing process of watching someone you love drift away so gradually that you don't even realize they're gone until the bed beside you is cold. When we met at an industry hospitality seminar in Atlanta, she was 24 and struggling. She was a junior coordinator for a mid-tier catering company, constantly stressed, underpaid, and unappreciated by her bosses. I was 28, working the grueling night shifts as a front desk supervisor at a boutique property in Midtown. I remember watching her argue with a vendor who had delivered the wrong linens, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and desperation. I had stepped in, quietly sorted out the logistics with the vendor using a few contacts I had, and bought her a terrible cup of conference coffee afterward. We talked for 4 hours that day. She told me about her dream of owning the premier event planning agency in Georgia. I listened, fascinated by her fire. She asked me about my plans, and I told her simply that I wanted to learn everything there was to know about hotels, from the laundry rooms to the penthouse suites. "You're so grounded, Terrance," she had told me a few months later, her head resting on my chest in our tiny, drafty apartment. "You're like the anchor I need when everything else is spinning out of control." For a long time, I was her anchor, and she was my sail. As her career began to take off, I made sure our home was a sanctuary. When she had early morning setups, I woke up at 4 to make her coffee and pack her breakfast. When she came home at midnight, exhausted and crying because a high-maintenance bride had screamed at her, I rubbed her feet and listened to her vent for hours. When her business needed capital to rent a proper office space in Buckhead, I quietly adjusted our household budget, took on extra shifts, and handed her the savings she needed, telling her it was just a lucky bonus from my work. But as Yvonne's agency grew, her social circle changed. She started rubbing shoulders with Atlanta's elite, wealthy developers, old money heirs, and flashy tech entrepreneurs. She began attending charity galas not as a coordinator, but as a guest. And she began looking at our modest life through a different lens. I'll never forget the dinner party she hosted at our apartment 5 years into our marriage. She had invited several of her high-profile clients and colleagues. I spent the entire weekend deep cleaning the place, preparing a 3-course meal, and making sure the wine pairings were perfect. During the main course, one of her guests, a wealthy real estate developer named Julian, looked at me condescendingly. "So, Terrance, Yvonne tells me you're in hotel management. Which fund do you manage? Or are you on the acquisition side?" Before I could answer, Yvonne laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound that made my stomach drop. "Oh, no, Julian. Terrance isn't on the corporate side. He's the operations manager at the local property. He's great at setting up rooms and keeping the staff in line, but he's strictly hands-on. He doesn't have any of those big, stressful corporate ambitions. He likes things simple." The table chuckled politely. I kept my face entirely neutral, took a sip of my water, and nodded. "Yes, I like to make sure the foundation is solid. Without operations, the acquisitions don't mean much." But after the guests left, as I was loading the dishwasher, Yvonne stood in the kitchen doorway, sipping the last of her wine. "Did you have to say that?" I asked quietly, not looking at her. "That I have no ambition?" Yvonne sighed, crossing her arms. "Terrance, let's be honest. You've been offered promotions to regional supervisor twice in the last 3 years, and you turned them down. You're comfortable where you are. There's nothing wrong with that. But you have to understand how it looks to my peers. I'm building a brand. I'm trying to climb. It's hard to do that when my husband is content carrying luggage and managing plumbing issues." She didn't understand. She had no idea that those promotions were corporate tests engineered by my family's lawyers, designed to see if I would try to bypass the strict rules set in my grandmother's will. And she certainly didn't know that the very hotel chain she was so eager to impress was named after my family. To Yvonne, the Ashford Grand was the ultimate status symbol. It was a legendary historic hotel, the kind of place where old money mingled with new wealth, and where a reservation in the main ballroom cost more than my annual salary as an operations manager. Over the years, she had booked dozens of weddings and galas here. She knew Bernard Lowe, the general manager, as a formidable, highly respected industry titan who rarely gave anyone the time of day. She always spoke of him with a kind of hushed reverence. "If I can get Bernard Lowe's seal of approval," she used to say, "my agency will be set for life." Now she had chosen this exact hotel to host the most important event of her personal life, her engagement party to Sherman Douglas. She wanted the world to see that she had finally arrived. She wanted her friends, her clients, and her peers to walk into the grand ballroom of the Ashford Grand and see her standing next to a man who matched her newly acquired lifestyle. And she had no idea that the quiet, blue-suited ex-husband she had warned to stay out of the way was the sole heir to the entire $180 million empire that owned every single brick of the building. My office door opened slowly, interrupting my thoughts. Bernard Lowe stepped in, closing the door behind him. He looked exhausted, his silver hair immaculate as always, but his eyes were filled with concern. "Terrance," Bernard said, leaning against the edge of my desk, "the catering staff is finishing the setup, but we have a problem. Sherman Douglas just demanded that we waive the service fee for the premium bar. He's claiming that he has an agreement with our regional office." I sat back, a cold smile touching my lips. "An agreement? What kind of agreement?" "He claims he's in talks with our corporate development team for a strategic partnership," Bernard said, shaking his head. "He's telling the staff that he's practically family now, and that they should treat this event as an internal, corporate function. He's being incredibly abusive to the bartenders." I stood up, smoothing the front of my navy blue jacket. "Let's go have a word with Mr. Douglas." We walked out of the basement and up the service stairs, entering the grand ballroom through the pantry doors. The room was massive, boasting towering crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bustling midtown skyline. Dozens of round tables were covered in heavy silk linens, and the scent of expensive perfume and fresh flowers was already filling the air. At the far end of the room, near the custom-built mahogany bar, Sherman Douglas was standing with his hands on his hips. He was red-faced, raising his voice at Kevin, a 22-year-old bartender who was visibly trembling. "It's a simple request, kid," Sherman sneered, tapping his manicured finger on the marble countertop. "I told you to swap out the standard bourbon for the 20-year reserve. And no, I'm not signing a surcharge slip for it. Just put it under the main event tab and waive the service premium. Your regional office is already reviewing my partnership proposal. If you make this difficult for me, I'll make sure your manager knows you're the reason the deal fell through." "I'm sorry, Mr. Douglas," Kevin stammered, holding a bottle of bourbon. "But our system requires a signature or a corporate authorization code for the premium tier. The operations manager has to sign off on—" "I don't care about your little system," Sherman interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Douglas?" I asked, stepping up to the bar. Bernard followed half a step behind me, his expression stony and imposing. Sherman turned around, his eyes narrowing as he saw me. "Ah, Terrance, just the man. Tell this kid to open the reserve bottles. He's refusing to update the bar menu for my VIP guests because of some administrative nonsense. I've already discussed our corporate integration with your high-ups. This event is practically a showcase for our upcoming venture." I looked at Kevin, who gave me a desperate look. I nodded at him. "Go check on the ice supply in the back, Kevin. I'll handle this." Once Kevin was out of earshot, I turned back to Sherman. "Mr. Douglas, the contract you and Yvonne signed clearly states that any upgrades to the premium liquor tier must be requested and paid for 48 hours in advance. If you want the 20-year reserve tonight, we can certainly accommodate you, but it will require a credit card authorization on file right now." Sherman scoffed, adjusting his floral-patterned jacket. "Are you deaf, Terrance? I just told you, I'm in active discussions with Wallace Heritage Corporate. Once my boutique hotel project launches, we're going to be partners. I'm practically doing this hotel a favor by bringing my high-net-worth investors here tonight. You should be waiving the entire bar bill, not nickel and diming me over a few bottles of bourbon. Until those corporate discussions turn into a signed, legal contract, you are a client of this hotel, not a partner," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and flat. "And our policy applies to everyone. If you want the reserve bottle, we need a card. Otherwise, we will continue serving the premium select tier that was agreed upon in your initial deposit. Sherman took a step closer, his eyes flashing with anger. He lowered his voice, trying to intimidate me. Listen to me, you glorified hall monitor. I know you're bitter because Yvonne left your stagnant, dead-end life for someone who actually knows how to make moves in this city. But don't let your petty jealousy ruin her night. If you mess up this party, I'll make sure Bernard Lowe fires you before the night is over. Bernard Lowe took a sharp breath beside me, his knuckles turning white as he clenched his hands. I placed a gentle hand on Bernard's arm, silently telling him to hold back. My personal life has nothing to do with hotel policy, Mr. Douglas, I said, looking him dead in the eye. The rule stands. No card, no reserve. Sherman stared at me for a long 3 seconds, his jaw tight. Fine, he hissed. Keep your cheap bourbon. My guests have better taste than to drink at a place run by people like you anyway. He turned on his heel and stormed off toward the VIP lounge. Bernard let out a long, frustrated sigh. I don't know how you do it, Terrance. The sheer arrogance of that man is staggering. He is a fraud. Let him play his game for now, Bernard, I said, turning away from the bar. Let's go back to your office. You said he put this hotel's address on his fundraising documents? Yes, Bernard said, guiding me through a restricted corridor that led to the executive wing of the hotel. That's actually why I called you earlier. It's much worse than just a guy throwing his weight around at the bar. We entered Bernard's spacious wood-paneled office. He closed the heavy door, walked over to his desk, and picked up a bound prospectus. He handed it to me. One of our regular corporate clients, an angel investor named Richard Vance, received this yesterday, Bernard explained. He knew my relationship with the Wallace family, so he brought it to my attention. Sherman is raising $15 million for a new boutique hotel concept called The Luminary. On page 12 of his investment deck, he lists the Ashford Grand as an active operational advisor and joint venture partner under the Wallace Heritage umbrella. I flipped to page 12. Sure enough, there was a high-resolution photo of our lobby, along with a paragraph claiming that the Douglas Group had secured a strategic partnership with Wallace Heritage Hotels to manage the back-of-the-house operations for his new project. It was a blatant lie. He's using our reputation, our history, and our credit rating to convince people to hand him millions of dollars, I said, my voice hardening. Exactly, Bernard nodded. And he's using his relationship with Yvonne as his foot in the door. Since Yvonne is a well-known event planner who regularly works with us, he's spinning a narrative to investors that he has an inside track to the Wallace family. I closed the prospectus and leaned against the edge of Bernard's mahogany desk. He didn't just fall in love with Yvonne, did he? He targeted her because she was his bridge to this hotel. It certainly looks that way, Bernard agreed. He met her at the Hospitality Expo 2 years ago, right around the time he started drafting this project. He knew she spent a lot of time here, and he knew she was married to an operations manager. He probably figured you were just some low-level obstacle he could easily sweep aside. I looked out the window, watching the Atlanta traffic crawl along Peachtree Boulevard. The irony was almost laughable. Yvonne had spent years accusing me of having no ambition because I refused to climb the corporate ladder. She never knew that my grandmother, Corrine Wallace, had written a very specific, unbreakable clause into her will. To inherit the family empire, I had to work from the absolute bottom for 10 consecutive years. No shortcuts, no special treatment, and no executive titles until the 10 years were complete. I had to prove I understood the sweat, the long hours, and the daily grind of the people who kept our hotels running. I had spent those 10 years doing exactly that. I washed linens, scrubbed kitchens, checked in late-night guests, and handled the daily complaints of difficult customers. I had only 3 months left of that 10-year requirement before I could finally step into my rightful role as the public chairman of the board. I had kept that secret from Yvonne, because I wanted our marriage to be based on who I was, not what I owned. But she couldn't handle the silence. She couldn't handle the fact that I didn't want to show off. She certainly didn't know that 3 years ago, when the Ashford Grand faced a sudden, catastrophic fire code violation that required a $4 million emergency renovation, the corporate board had hesitated to fund it. To save the hotel and protect my grandmother's legacy, I had secretly authorized the release of my personal trust fund dividends to cover the entire cost. I had spent 6 months working 18-hour days, managing the construction crews at night after finishing my day shifts, all while pretending to Yvonne that I was just working overtime for extra hourly pay. She had screamed at me back then, calling me a fool for exhausting myself for a company that didn't care about me. "You're killing yourself for a basic manager's wage." "Terrance!" she had yelled, throwing a kitchen towel at me. "When are you going to wake up and realize you're just a cog in their machine?" I had taken the yelling in silence, knowing that without my overtime, the very hotel she hosted her events in would have been shuttered and sold off to developers. "Terrance," Bernard's voice broke my train of thought. "What do you want to do? I can have our legal team send Sherman a cease and desist order right now. We can shut down his party and throw him out." "No," I said quietly, a cold, deliberate plan forming in my mind. "Don't do that yet. He wants a stage tonight to show off to his investors. Let's let him have his stage. Let's let him get completely comfortable. The higher he climbs, the harder he's going to fall." By 6 o'clock, the Ashford Grand was humming with the energy of Atlanta's high society. Valet attendants in gold-trimmed vests were sprinting back and forth, parking a continuous line of luxury sedans and sports cars that stretched down Peachtree Boulevard. The evening air was warm, carrying the faint scent of exhaust and expensive cologne. I stood near the front entrance, just inside the glass doors, watching the chaos. The valet team was short-staffed because 2 of the evening shift drivers had called in sick. Cars were backing up, and a few drivers were starting to honk. Without a word, I stepped out onto the driveway, rolled up the sleeves of my navy blue jacket, and began directing traffic, waving cars into the bypass lanes and coordinating the keys with the remaining attendants. "Terrance, what on earth are you doing?" I turned around to see Yvonne standing under the grand canopy. She looked incredibly elegant in her red dress, but her face was pinched with embarrassment. She had a glass of white wine in one hand and her phone in the other. "The driveway is backing up, Yvonne," I said, stepping aside as a black Mercedes pulled up. "If we don't clear the bottleneck, your guests are going to be sitting in traffic for 20 minutes. "I don't care about the bottleneck," she whispered harshly, stepping closer so the valet drivers couldn't hear. "I care about how it looks. Some of Sherman's most important investors are pulling up right now. Do you think I want them to see my ex-husband directing cars like a traffic cop? It's humiliating, Terrance. Go inside. Let the kids handle the cars." I looked at her for a quiet moment. She was so focused on the illusion of prestige that she couldn't see the practical reality right in front of her. "The kids are doing their best, but they're overwhelmed. If you want your guests to have a good experience, the driveway needs to be clear." "Just go, Terrance," she hissed, turning away as a group of women in evening gowns walked toward the entrance. Her expression transformed instantly into a warm, radiant smile. "Hi, girls. Oh, thank you so much for coming. Yes, isn't the Ashford gorgeous? Come inside, the champagne is flowing." I watched her guide her friends through the lobby. I didn't feel angry. I just felt a profound sense of exhaustion. I walked back inside, smoothed my jacket, and headed toward the grand ballroom to ensure the banquet staff was keeping up with the food stations. The ballroom was spectacular. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the crowd of nearly 150 guests. At the far side of the room, Sherman was holding court. He was surrounded by a group of older men dressed in conservative, expensive dark suits. These were the institutional investors he had been courting for months. Among them was Richard Vance. Richard was a tall, sharp-eyed man in his late 50s, wearing a bespoke gray suit. He was a regular guest at the Ashford Grand, a major real estate developer, and a close friend of Bernard Lowe. He was also one of the primary targets for Sherman's fundraising campaign. As I walked past the edge of their circle to check on the buffet setup, I heard Sherman's voice booming over the ambient noise of the room. "The Luminary isn't just a hotel, Richard," Sherman was saying, gesturing with his champagne flute. "It's a lifestyle concept, and we aren't starting from scratch. By partnering with the Wallace Heritage Group, we are inheriting 60 years of operational excellence. They're going to handle everything behind the scenes, leaving my team to focus on the luxury experience." Richard Vance took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes scanning the ballroom. "And you're sure the Wallace family is fully committed to this joint venture, Sherman? I've known Bernard Lowe for a long time, and the Wallaces are notoriously conservative when it comes to brand partnerships." "Oh, absolutely," Sherman said, without a hint of hesitation. "I've been in direct talks with their regional leadership. In fact, we chose the Ashford Grand for tonight specifically to show you the kind of standard we'll be maintaining. The owner of the chain has personally reviewed our prospectus." I stopped near a decorative pillar, adjusting the placement of a silver warming tray. Richard Vance's eyes drifted over Sherman's shoulder and landed directly on me. He blinked, a look of recognition crossing his face. Because Richard stayed in our executive suite several times a month, we had spoken many times. He knew me as the incredibly efficient operations manager who had once personally tracked down a misplaced briefcase containing his legal documents. "Terrance," Richard called out, stepping away from Sherman's circle. "Good evening. I didn't realize you were managing the floor tonight." I turned and smiled politely. "Good evening, Mr. Vance. It's always a pleasure to have you at the Ashford. I wanted to make sure everything was running smoothly for the event." Sherman's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He looked between Richard and me, clearly annoyed that a VIP investor was familiar with a member of the service staff. He stepped in quickly, placing a patronizing hand on my shoulder. "Ah, Richard, you know Terrance?" Sherman laughed, a loud, empty sound. "Yes, Terrance is our operations guy here. He's great with the physical labor, keeps the lights on and the floors swept. He's actually Yvonne's ex-husband, believe it or not. We keep him close because he knows where all the light switches are." The other investors in the group chuckled politely. Richard Vance, however, did not laugh. His sharp eyes moved from Sherman's smug face to my calm, unbothered expression. "Is that so?" Richard said slowly. "I've always found Terrance's understanding of this property's mechanics to be rather exceptional. He solved a major logistical issue for my firm last quarter." "Well, anyone can learn to run a vacuum, Richard," Sherman said dismissively, squeezing my shoulder a bit too hard before letting go. "It's the strategic vision that's hard to find. Now, let me show you the architectural renderings for the Luminary's lobby. I have the display board set up near the stage." He guided the investors away, but Richard Vance looked back at me over his shoulder, his eyebrow raised in a silent, questioning gesture. I gave him a microscopic nod. "Terrance," a quiet voice spoke from behind me. I turned to see Yvonne. Her perfect composure was starting to crack. She looked stressed, her eyes darting toward the banquet kitchen doors. "The kitchen says we're running low on the sea bass," she whispered, her voice tight. "How is that possible? I RSVP'd for exactly 140 guests." "Your RSVP list was 140, Yvonne," I replied calmly, pulling up the banquet manifest on my tablet. "But Sherman invited an extra 15 investment prospects and their spouses at the last minute, without updating the catering coordinator. You actually have 170 people in this room." Yvonne gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God, we're going to run out of food. If Sherman's investors see that we didn't prepare enough, it will look incredibly unprofessional. Terrance, you have to do something. Please." For a second, the hard, independent exterior she had worn since our divorce slipped away. She looked at me the way she used to when we were married, relying on me to quietly fix the disasters she couldn't handle. "It's already handled, Yvonne," I said softly. I saw the extra guest registrations this afternoon. I had the chef prepare an extra 20 portions of the roasted chicken breast, and we slightly adjusted the plating of the sea bass to stretch the portions without changing the presentation. No one will notice, and everyone will be fed. She stared at me, her chest rising and falling. A mixture of relief and confusion flickered in her eyes. You did that this afternoon?" "It's my job," I said simply. Before she could say anything else, the house lights dimmed slightly, and a chime rang out through the ballroom speakers. Sherman was standing on the main stage, holding a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sherman's voice echoed through the massive room, drawing everyone's attention. "If I could have your attention for just a moment." Yvonne gave me one last, lingering look before turning and quickly walking toward the stage to take her place beside her new fiancé. I stepped back into the shadows of the ballroom, watching the stage as the trap Sherman had built for himself began to snap shut. Sherman stood on the raised wooden platform at the end of the ballroom, his chest puffed out as he adjusted the microphone. The spotlight caught the intricate, shiny patterns of his suit, making him look even more theatrical. Yvonne stood a few steps behind him, her hands clasped in front of her red dress, looking up at him with a mixture of pride and anxiety. "Testing, testing. Can everyone hear me?" Sherman's voice boomed through the high-end sound system of the Ashford Grand. The ambient chatter in the ballroom quickly died down as guests turned their attention toward the stage. Waiters paused with their trays, and the bartenders stopped shaking drinks. "First of all, I want to thank all of you for being here tonight," Sherman began, flashing a practiced, charming smile that looked like it belonged in a luxury real estate commercial. "Tonight is not just a celebration of love. It's a celebration of a new chapter, a joining of forces, and the birth of a vision that is going to redefine hospitality in the city of Atlanta." He gestured toward Yvonne, who smiled warmly and waved to the crowd. "When I met Yvonne, I didn't just find the love of my life. I found a partner who shares my relentless drive to build something extraordinary. As many of you know, Yvonne has spent years coordinating some of the most prestigious events in this city, particularly right here at the beautiful Ashford Grand. And it is that exact spirit of excellence that inspired my newest venture." With a click of a small remote in his hand, the massive projector screen behind him lit up. The slide showed a sleek, modern architectural rendering of a high-rise boutique hotel with the name The Luminary written in a gold font. Underneath the title, in slightly smaller letters, were the words, "In partnership with Wallace Heritage Hotels." I watched from the dim shadow near the pantry entrance, my arms crossed. Beside me, Bernard Lowe's face was hard as stone. I could feel the tension radiating off him. He looked like he wanted to rip the projector screen down himself. I put a hand on his shoulder, signaling him to wait. "The Luminary," Sherman continued, his voice rising with theatrical enthusiasm, "is going to be Atlanta's premier boutique luxury experience. But we aren't doing this alone. As you can see, we have secured an operational advisory partnership with none other than the Wallace Heritage Group. By combining our fresh, cutting-edge design with their 60 years of legendary, back-of-the-house operational expertise, we are guaranteeing our investors an unmatched return on investment." Sherman paused, letting the words sink in. He made direct eye contact with Richard Vance, who was standing near the front of the stage, holding his glass of scotch. "I see some of our city's finest financial minds in the room tonight," Sherman said, nodding toward Richard. "And I want to tell you that this is a ground floor opportunity. We are closing our initial $15 million funding round next week. With the operational backing of a $180 million empire like Wallace Heritage, the risk is practically zero. We are building the future, ladies and gentlemen." The room erupted into polite applause. Several of the investors in the crowd nodded in approval, whispered to each other, and looked impressed. Yvonne beamed, her eyes sparkling as she looked at the screen and then at Sherman. She truly believed that her new fiancé was a genius who had just secured the deal of a lifetime. She had no idea that the entire presentation was a house of cards built on a foundation of lies. Sherman held up his hands to quiet the applause. Now, before we raise a glass, I want to invite a very special guest to say a few words. He is a man who needs no introduction in the Atlanta hospitality scene. He has managed this iconic property for over 2 decades, and he represents the very standard of excellence we are bringing to the Luminary. Please welcome the general manager of the Ashford Grand, Mr. Bernard Lowe. The applause started up again. Sherman looked toward the side of the stage, expecting Bernard to walk up, shake his hand, and offer a glowing endorsement of the partnership. Bernard looked at me. His eyes were sharp, filled with a quiet, dangerous intensity. "Are you ready, Terrance?" Bernard whispered. "Go ahead, Bernard," I said softly. "It's time to tell them who actually owns this place." Bernard adjusted his silver tie, straightened his immaculate suit jacket, and walked out of the shadows. He walked with a slow, dignified pace that commanded respect. He climbed the steps of the stage, his face entirely unreadable. Sherman smiled warmly, extending his hand as Bernard approached the microphone. But Bernard didn't look at Sherman's hand. He bypassed it completely, walking straight to the microphone stand. Sherman's hand hung in the air for an awkward second before he slowly pulled it back, his smile stiffening slightly. Bernard gripped the sides of the podium and looked out at the crowd. The room fell completely silent. Everyone knew Bernard Lowe. He was a legend in the city, a man who didn't play corporate games and who possessed absolute authority over the Ashford Grand. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." Bernard's deep, resonant voice echoed through the ballroom. "Thank you for joining us tonight at the Ashford Grand. As the general manager of this property, it is always my privilege to welcome guests into our halls." He paused, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, before landing squarely on the group of investors standing near the front. "Mr. Douglas has spoken quite passionately tonight about his vision for the Luminary and his supposed partnership with our parent company, Wallace Heritage Hotels," Bernard said, his tone perfectly polite, but cold as ice. "However, as the senior executive representative of the Wallace family in this region, I have a duty to maintain the absolute transparency and integrity of our brand." A subtle murmur went through the crowd. Sherman's brow furrowed, a look of sudden unease crossing his face. Yvonne's smile froze. "I want to make a formal clarification," Bernard continued, his voice clear and unwavering. "Wallace Heritage Hotels has never entered into any partnership, joint venture, or operational agreement with the Douglas Group or the Luminary Project. No such discussions have ever occurred at the corporate level, and no such agreement will ever be authorized." The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet of the ballroom. Sherman's face drained of color, turning a sickly, pale white. "Bernard, what are you—" he began to whisper, taking a step toward the microphone, but Bernard ignored him entirely. "Our brand, which was founded 60 years ago by the late Corrine Wallace, is built on trust, hard work, and absolute honesty," Bernard said, his voice ringing with authority. "We do not allow our name, our reputation, or our properties to be used to mislead investors, and I am particularly displeased that this deception has been brought into our home tonight." The crowd began to whisper frantically. Richard Vance stepped forward, his eyes narrowed as he stared up at Sherman. "Bernard!" Sherman finally snapped, his voice cracking as he reached for the microphone. "This is highly unprofessional. There must be a misunderstanding with your regional office. I have been in talks with—" "You have not been in talks with anyone, Mr. Douglas," Bernard cut him off, his voice flat. "Because the sole owner and active chairman of the Wallace Heritage Corporate Board is present in this room tonight, and he has never heard of you." Bernard looked past the stage, his eyes locking onto me as I stood in the back of the room. He raised his hand, pointing directly toward the shadows. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bernard announced, "please welcome the heir, owner, and president of Wallace Heritage Hotels, Mr. Terrance Wallace. Every head in the room turned. The spotlight shifted away from the stage, sweeping across the grand ballroom until the bright, white beam landed directly on me. Yvonne's eyes followed the light. She looked at me, her mouth parting in utter disbelief as she saw her quiet, unambitious ex-husband standing under the spotlight, dressed in a simple navy blue suit, looking back at her with absolute calm. The whispers in the grand ballroom grew from a low hum into a deafening roar of conversation. The bright, white beam of the spotlight felt warm on my face, but I didn't blink. I didn't turn away. I just stood there, hands loosely clasped in front of my navy blue suit, looking directly at the stage. Yvonne looked as if she had been struck by lightning. Her hands, which had been so confidently clasped just a moment ago, flew to her mouth. Her sharp, beautiful face was completely pale, her eyes wide as she stared at me across the sea of tables. The red of her dress, which had felt so vibrant and commanding all evening, now seemed to make her look incredibly fragile under the harsh house lights. She took a half step backward, her heels catching slightly on the edge of the wooden platform. She shook her head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, as if trying to clear a hallucination. "Terrance?" she whispered, though her voice was lost in the noise of the crowd. Beside her, Sherman was disintegrating. The smug, polished businessman who had been patronizing the staff and bragging to investors just minutes ago was completely gone. His jaw was slack, his chest heaving under his floral-patterned jacket. He looked from Bernard Lowe to me, his eyes darting frantically around the room as he realized every single investor he had spent months courting was now staring at him with cold, accusing eyes. Richard Vance was the first to move. He slowly set his scotch glass down on a nearby table with a sharp, clear clink. He looked up at Sherman, his face devoid of any warmth. "A strategic partnership, Sherman?" Richard's voice was quiet, but in the sudden tension of the room, it carried perfectly. "An active operational advisor? You stood there and told me the owner of this chain had personally reviewed your prospectus." "Richard, please, let me explain," Sherman stammered, stepping down from the stage, his hands raised in a desperate, pleading gesture. "There's been an administrative mix-up. The regional development team. I have the emails, I can show you." "Don't bother," Richard interrupted, his voice cutting through Sherman's excuses like a knife. "I've been doing business in Atlanta for 30 years, Douglas. I know when I'm being lied to. And I certainly know when someone is using a reputable family name to run a fundraising scam." He turned his back on Sherman, walking straight toward the exit. The other investors in the circle immediately followed Richard's lead. One by one, they turned away from Sherman, leaving him standing alone in the center aisle of the ballroom. The very people who were supposed to hand him $15 million next week were now walking out of his party, their expressions filled with disgust and embarrassment. "Wait, Richard, please, just 5 minutes," Sherman called out, his voice cracking with desperation. He tried to follow them, but his legs seemed heavy, his swagger completely drained. Yvonne finally found her voice. She stepped down from the stage, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor as she hurried toward Sherman. "Sherman, what is going on? What did Mr. Lowe mean? Why is he calling Terrance the owner?" Sherman turned on her, his face twisted in a mixture of panic and sudden rage. "How the hell should I know, Yvonne? You told me he was a nobody. You told me he was just a low-level manager who was content cleaning toilets. You're his ex-wife. How did you not know this?" I didn't," Yvonne stammered, her voice shaking. She looked back at me, her eyes begging for an explanation, for some sign that this was all a cruel joke. "Terrance, is this true?" I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. Bernard Lowe stepped down from the stage, 2 of our heavy-set security guards in black suits walking closely behind him. Bernard walked straight up to Sherman, his expression completely professional, but entirely uncompromising. "Mr. Douglas," Bernard said, his voice loud enough for the remaining guests to hear. At this point, Your event contract with the Ashford Grand is being terminated for violating our corporate code of conduct and utilizing our brand name for unauthorized financial solicitation. Your guests are welcome to finish their drinks, but I must ask you and your promotional materials to leave the premises immediately." "You can't do this," Sherman yelled, his face turning a deep, angry red. "I paid a deposit. I have a contract." "The contract has an explicit clause regarding the unauthorized use of our intellectual property and physical assets for external fundraising," Bernard replied calmly, gesturing to the security guards. "Your deposit is forfeited. Please gather your display boards and leave, or our security team will escort you out." Sherman looked at the two security guards, who stepped forward, their physical presence imposing and undeniable. He looked around the ballroom, realizing that almost half of his guests had already slipped out the side doors to avoid being associated with the scandal. The remaining guests were whispering, pointing, and holding up their phones. With a bitter, defeated curse, Sherman grabbed his leather portfolio from a nearby table, knocked over one of the orchid centerpieces in his haste, and stormed toward the service exit, not even looking back at Yvonne. Yvonne stood completely still in the middle of the ruined ballroom. The white orchids she had spent all afternoon obsessing over were scattered on the floor. Her friends, her clients, and her colleagues were either leaving in silence or staring at her with pity. The social standing she had, spent years trying to build, had evaporated in a matter of minutes. She looked at me one last time, her eyes shining with unshed tears, before she turned and ran out of the room toward the guest elevators. I watched her go, a quiet heaviness in my chest. I turned to Bernard, who was directing the staff to clean up the spilled flowers. "Thank you, Bernard," I said quietly. "I'm sorry we had to do it this way, Terrance," Bernard said, looking at me with genuine concern. "But he was going to ruin people's lives with that scam, and your grandmother's legacy deserved better than to be used by a man like that." "I know," I said. I pulled off my operations earpiece and set it on the bar. "I'll be in my office if anyone needs me." I walked out of the ballroom, leaving the whispers and the flashing lights behind. I walked down the quiet, carpeted corridor of the executive wing, down the back stairs, and into the cool, silent basement. I opened the door to my small operations office, turned on the single overhead fluorescent light, and sat down at my desk. The framed photo of Yvonne and me in Savannah was still sitting there, tucked behind the schedules. I picked it up, looking at her young, happy face. A soft knock on the door broke the silence. I didn't need to ask who it was. I set the frame down. "Come in, Yvonne." The door pushed open slowly. Yvonne stepped into my small, cramped office. Her red dress looked out of place against the gray metal filing cabinets and the boxes of cleaning supplies. Her makeup was slightly smudged, and her eyes were red. She closed the door behind her, leaning against it as if she didn't have the strength to stand on her own. "Why, Terrance?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, trembling with an intensity that seemed to fill the tiny room. "Why did you let me find out like that? In front of everyone? At my own engagement party?" I pulled a simple plastic chair from the corner of the office and pushed it toward her. "Sit down, Yvonne." She looked at the chair, then at me, before slowly sinking into it. Her shoulders, usually held so high and rigid, slumped. She looked incredibly small in this cramped space, surrounded by stacks of paper, cleaning supply invoices, and the hum of the ventilation shafts. "I didn't set this up, Yvonne," I said, leaning back against the edge of my desk. "I didn't plan for any of this to happen tonight. I was just doing my job, making sure your party ran smoothly." "Then why?" she choked out, her voice cracking as she looked up, her eyes watery. "Why did Mr. Lowe do that? He ruined Sherman. He ruined my life in front of everyone I've ever cared about. If you owned this place, why didn't you just tell me? Why let it go this far?" "Because Bernard discovered what Sherman was doing," I replied, my voice steady, devoid of any anger or triumph. Sherman wasn't just throwing a party here, Yvonne. He was using the Ashford Grand's name, our reputation, and our 60-year history to run a massive investment scam. He put this hotel's address and our corporate brand on his fundraising prospectus, claiming we were joint venture partners. Yvonne blinked, stunned. No, Sherman said he was in talks with your corporate office. He said it was practically a done deal. There was no deal, I said flatly. There were never any talks. Sherman lied to you, and he lied to his investors. He was trying to raise $15 million under false pretenses. Richard Vance, the man Sherman was targeting tonight, is a close friend of Bernard's. If Bernard hadn't stepped up and corrected the record tonight, Sherman would have taken millions of dollars from those people. And when the project inevitably failed, our family's company would have been dragged into a massive legal and financial nightmare. Bernard did what he had to do to protect the legacy my grandmother built. Yvonne stared at her lap, her hands shaking as she processed the information. He lied to me. He told me he was building something incredible for us. Sherman didn't target you because he loved you, Yvonne, I said softly, hating to be the one delivering the blow, but she needed to hear it. He targeted you because you are a prominent event planner who practically lived at this hotel. He knew your name was associated with the Ashford Grand. By marrying you, he gained a plausible connection to the Wallace Heritage brand. He used you as a shield to make his scam look legitimate. She covered her face with her hands, a quiet, ragged sob escaping her throat. The realization of how thoroughly she had been manipulated was washing over her, stripping away the last of her pride. I was so stupid. I thought he was the one who was going to take me to the next level. She cried quietly for a few minutes. I didn't reach out to comfort her. Too much had passed between us, and the boundary was clear. I simply waited, letting her release the grief and the shock. Finally, she wiped her eyes with the tissue from my desk, her breathing slowing down. She looked around the tiny, dim office, her gaze stopping on the framed photo of us in Savannah. Bernard mentioned something else, she said, her voice hollow. He said you had a 10-year clause in a will. What did he mean by that? I took a deep breath, looking down at the worn linoleum floor. My grandmother, Corrine Wallace, founded this company in 1962 with a single motel on the outskirts of Savannah. She built this entire $180 million empire with nothing but sweat, long hours, and absolute grit. She passed away 10 years ago. I looked back up at Yvonne. In her will, she left the entire company to me, but she knew that inheriting that kind of wealth too early could ruin a person. She didn't want a grandson who sat in a penthouse suite, looking down at the staff. She wanted me to understand what it actually takes to run this place. So she put a mandatory, unbreakable clause in her will. Before I could inherit a single share of the company or take my place as chairman of the board, I had to work from the floor, at the entry level, for 10 consecutive years. Yvonne's jaw dropped slightly. 10 years. 10 years, I confirmed. No shortcuts, no special privileges, no executive titles. I had to wash linens, scrub toilets, work the night desk, and manage the daily operations just like every other employee. If I broke the rule, even once, the entire estate would be liquidated and donated to charity. I made a promise to her on her deathbed that I would see it through. And tonight, I am exactly 3 months away from completing those 10 years. Yvonne sat in absolute silence, her eyes darting around as she did the math in her head. 11 years, she whispered, her voice barely audible. We were married for 11 years. That means the entire time we were together. Yes, I said. During our entire marriage, I was fulfilling that promise. Every late shift, every physical chore, every time I came home exhausted with grease on my shirt, it was all part of the work. I wasn't doing it because I lacked ambition, Yvonne. I was doing it because I was building the foundation to run a legacy. But why didn't you tell me? She cried out, her voice filled with a painful mixture of anger and regret. "We were married, Terrance. We shared a bed. We shared a life. How could you keep something like that from me? If I had known, I would have supported you. I wouldn't have said those things to you." "Would you?" I asked quietly, looking her dead in the eye. The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Yvonne opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. She looked away, unable to maintain eye contact. "I wanted to tell you, Yvonne," I said, my voice softening. "More than once, I almost did, especially when things got hard, and when you started looking at me with that disappointment in your eyes. But I wanted our marriage to be based on who I was, not what I owned. I wanted to know that you loved the man who washed the dishes and helped you pack your catering vans, not the guy with a $180 million trust fund. And as the years went on, and you became more obsessed with status, with Buckhead social circles, and with what your friends thought of my job, I realized that if I told you the truth, it would change everything, but for the wrong reasons." "That's not fair," she whispered, tears spilling over her eyelashes again. "You made me feel like I was the one who was materialistic. You let me walk away, Terrance. You let me divorce you because you wouldn't just take a step up." "I offered you a life, Yvonne," I said. "I offered you a solid, quiet, loving home. I handled the bills, I supported your agency, and I made sure you had everything you needed to chase your dreams. But you wanted more than a partner. You wanted a trophy. You wanted a husband you could brag about at cocktail parties. If I had to buy your love and respect with a corporate title and a family fortune, then what we had wasn't real anyway. My grandmother's legacy was a promise I made to her, but my marriage was a promise I made to you. I kept both, in the only way I knew how. You're the one who decided the foundation wasn't flashy enough." Yvonne closed her eyes, bowing her head as the truth finally settled in. The realization that she had thrown away a genuine, devoted husband, who was also the very billionaire heir she had spent her life trying to find, was a weight she could barely carry. She stood up slowly, her knees trembling slightly. She didn't look at me. She couldn't. She walked toward the heavy metal door, her fingers resting on the handle for a long, quiet moment. "I'm sorry, Terrance," she whispered, her voice thick with regret. "I really am." "I know, Yvonne," I said quietly. "I hope you find what you're looking for." She opened the door and walked out into the cool, silent corridor, leaving me alone in the quiet hum of the basement. The fallout from that night was swift and absolute. Within days, Richard Vance and other investors withdrew their interest in The Luminary, demanding a full audit of Sherman Douglas's fundraising documents. Without the operational backing of Wallace Heritage Hotels, Sherman's boutique hotel project crumbled into nothingness. Faced with fraud charges and a ruined reputation, he left Atlanta by the end of the month in disgrace. The engagement was broken, and his wedding with Yvonne was postponed indefinitely before being called off entirely. Yvonne didn't reach out to me again, and I didn't seek her out. The quiet baseline of our new lives had been established. She had closed her Buckhead agency and relocated to Savannah, returning to smaller, quieter wedding events. Sometimes, Bernard would quietly mention seeing her name on a local boutique wedding registry, but we never spoke of her directly. Her chapter in my life had closed, leaving behind only the quiet lessons of a love that couldn't survive the weight of its own expectations. 6 months later, the lobby of the Ashford Grand was once again filled with people, but the atmosphere was entirely different. There were no flashy lights, no dramatic floral arrangements, and no hollow promises. The board, regional managers, and nearly every member of our staff, from the laundry team to the front desk clerks, gathered under the high mahogany ceilings. It was the 10th anniversary of the day I had signed my grandmother's inheritance agreement. Bernard Lowe stood at the podium, smiling warmly as he read the official corporate resolution. When he called my name, the room erupted into a thunderous applause that felt entirely real, born from a decade of shared sweat and mutual respect. I walked up to the microphone, wearing a tailored navy blue suit that finally carried the weight of my true title, Executive Chairman of Wallace Heritage Hotels. I looked out at the proud faces of the people I had worked alongside in the trenches. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady and clear. My grandmother, Corrine, believed that a hotel is only as strong as the people who keep it running when no one is looking. For 10 years, I've had the privilege of standing in the shadows with you. Today, we continue to build her incredible legacy, together. I didn't mention Yvonne. I didn't need to. The truth had finally spoken, and the silence that followed was exactly what I had worked 10 years to earn. Some promises are only meaningful when kept in silence, but if you let the person you love believe your humility is a lack of ambition, one day the truth will speak for itself, whether you want it to or not.